Hello, and welcome to the Composers Workshop. My name is Mimi Waitsman, and I'm the Senior Curator of Musical Collections and Cultures at the Horniman Museum and Gardens in Southeast London. The seed for the Composers Workshop was planted by Jane Chapman, a harpsichordist well known for championing new works for old instruments. On learning of the Horniman's Hear It Live program using historical instruments from the recently dispersed Finchcocks Collection, she saw an opportunity to unite them with the creativity of her current composition students. The Horniman was delighted with the idea, and the three composers were introduced to the 1668 Guarracino virginals in December 2019. Intrigued and inspired by the instrument's distinctive features, each wished to write a new composition for it. These would be premiered by Jane as one of the weekly half-hour Hear It Live programs being presented in the museum's music gallery through the support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But then the COVID pandemic struck. Although live programming was suspended, the reconfiguration of Hear It Live into a digital online series invited this further development. Rather than just hearing the composer's pieces, there was a chance to elucidate intricacies of the compositional process and to make them more widely accessible. And so this set of videos, the Composer's Workshop, was born. I hope you enjoy them.
Hi, my name is Olly Sellwood, and my piece for the virginals is called A Short Fantasia Starting on C. The piece combines a live virginals part with a tape part made from pre-recorded virginal samples and runs alongside the live virginals part. The tape part plays with the tuning of the virginals by altering some of the different tuning systems within the piece. As the virginals is tuned in mean tone tuning, and some of the electronics alter this tuning into different tuning systems, we get a combination of different pitches, and this really is an interplay within the piece. There are two key ideas throughout the main body of the piece, and perhaps we could think of the live part and the tape part as working in dialogue with each other. And then towards the end of the piece, these two parts come together, and eventually the tape part overwhelms the live virginals part.
I find the title of your piece really intriguing, partly because Fantasia or Fantasy or Fantasia in C, or starting on C, is so evocative of music from another age, really. But of course, this is a 21st century piece, and you are a 21st century composer. So if I was playing Frescobaldi or Bach or a composer from the past, I would have some idea of the style. Hopefully, of course, the composer would be here telling me how to play it. So it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you about that. So when you composed this piece, what was going on in your mind about the kind of style and the instrument and the kind of techniques that I might be able to use?
So I think that this piece developed in a semi-improvisational way. Hence the reference in the title to the Fantasia and some of the improvisational qualities which come with that type of music. And I was really thinking of some phrases, some musical phrases which were quite short but started in the same place and ended in the same place. But perhaps the journey between the beginning and the end was developed in different ways, either through the live musical material on the virginals or through the accompanying tape part. And really those changes between the starting point and the end part of those phrases is the interest in the opening parts of the piece. And we hear this in different ways. So first of all, just with the virginals by the live virginals part. And then secondly, with an adapted tape part where samples of the virginals are used in different ways to recreate or rebuild some of those musical ideas, but slightly altered through different tuning operations, so it's through audio effect processing, which I did on the computer after we sampled the virginals.
I'm intrigued by this musical texture, because you've got this lovely single line at the beginning, then you've got these really lovely sort of repeated little patterns, which feel very much from another time almost, with the kind of 21st century slant on them. So for me, the musical texture of this is really interesting. And these kind of things here, where you've got a little bit strange little glimmering, shimmering moments. Perhaps something else too, which I found really interesting, which really suits this instrument, because this has got a particular sonority, is being able to overhold a chord like that, all under the hand, and then be able to leap over the hands in that way, which is almost very Scarlatti-like, a sort of 18th century composer. So did you have any of that in your mind at all, or were you trying to evoke any composers from the past, or techniques from the past, or did the instrument itself speak to you in some way?
So I wasn't overtly trying to reference any other styles of music, but I think that perhaps through the development process of the material, some of the rhythmic and textual developments start to become quite reminiscent of perhaps other types of music. And this, I think, is really supported by the timbre of the virginals. And so, whereas I was thinking of them compositionally as textual or rhythmic or dynamic development, perhaps we perceive them as something which is more of a cultural reference, which wasn't in intention, but it was perhaps a happy kind of output from
So when you say dynamic development, what do you mean by dynamic in that context?
I was thinking about this in terms of energy and energy development as well. So we're thinking of perhaps those opening phrases being quite sparse in texture, and the amount of energy required by the performer to make these phrases sound is limited. Whereas later on, with the extra notes, with those extra rhythmic phrases, the ones which you've just demonstrated, they really push more energy into the piece because of the performer's input. And so I think those changes as well were important to me. And that's also something which is replicated in the tape part. So the more input energy by the performer, the more output sound through the audio processing. So there is a kind of relationship there. They're not completely separate, that your actions have audio effects as a result of the processing.
So that's interesting, talking about different energy levels and different speeds of notes, I suppose, and the way different notes build up on top of each other. And as I demonstrated there, how you can create this gorgeous chord and this singing sound through overholding the notes, because obviously on an instrument such as this, there is no louds and softs as such. Everything is done through the touch, through the way you release the notes, where you hold the notes down, the density of the chords, the sparseness of the notes, the number of notes that are on top of each other, and so on. And I think it's very interesting. You should think of that as a kind of dynamic, rather than, as most people think, dynamics as meaning loud and soft. You're seeing it as being energy, and I think that's a really interesting way to approach this instrument.
Yeah, I think it's thinking of the instrument as a piece of technology is interesting to me as a composer, because that affords possibility. And we think about what the virginals can do and what it can't do as well. So you were talking about sustaining notes. Clearly there is resonance, and there is some sustained by the natural kind of acoustics of the room, but also through the construction of the instrument. But it wouldn't last indefinitely if you held a note. So part of the intervention on the take part is to fix that problem by providing these artificial durational moments. And I say fix because I think technology is often used in that kind of way to solve problems. And although I'm approaching it in this particular way, obviously this is not a problem, it's just a quality from the instrument, and a really lovely quality from the instrument. So it's perhaps taking these things and just finding different ways that the technology can intervene in the natural, or perhaps not natural, but the physical construction of the instrument itself. Could we sample the virginal from the lowest pitches all the way to the highest pitches, please?
Yes, and why would you like me to do that?
This is going to form part of the electronics that accompany the piece.
Right. Gosh, that's quite an interesting piece in itself, because you can really hear the difference in the semitone sort of wideness or shortness or narrowness, particularly
some of those low notes,
really interesting. And also we've got the short octave. So we've got E, D, and C.
Such an unusual configuration.
Well, it's very typical of this instrument, of course, means that you can do nice big intervals, leaps and tones.
Fantastic, thank you so much.
Good. Well, and what are you going to do with those actual sounds? Are you going to process them in some way?
Yes, so some of the processing involves some tuning changes. So taking the mean tone and then applying some different kind of tuning systems to the notes from the virginal.
So you'll be kind of bending them, starting off with the pitches and then bending them, or?
Yeah, so some of them will be bent and some of them will be just retuned slightly. So you get two different tuning systems at different times.
And what I was quite careful to do as well there was to lift up the notes, not terribly subtly, so that you've got a little bit of the action sound as well. So there's a tiny click, which I think is also so much part of the instrument. And something when you finish a piece, you if you play a chord and hum along the weight, that little tiny bit, which is so much, to me, part of the whole virginals sound. And it's something as a player that you use a lot, as punctuation almost, as a rhythmic sort of feature of your music.
I think it was one of the things that struck me first when I heard it was that mechanical sound. Hearing the mechanisms at work really contribute to the overall quality of the sound.
Yeah, I think in your piece too, when you've got the sort of triplet rhythms and the different patterns, I'll just be all right. Just think about the sort of articulation that you've got with these short notes. You can feel them coming off of them. These kind of gestures, which work really well. And then you've got your So all the time I'm working with articulation to try and get a character into the music as well.
Yeah, there's those two noises, the one where the key is depressed, when we hear the pitch, but then when the key is released, then you get that mechanical noise as well. So for those notes that are in space, it feels like they have a kind of double sound. And that's, I think, quite clear in the opening bits, but perhaps gets blended more in the overall sound with the slightly faster passages.
Yeah, and also that overholding of this, all that kind of thing, means you've got the contrast of the left hand leaping over very short and then being able to hold the notes down to create a kind of sustain on the instrument.
Yes.
Which I think works so well in this piece.
And which the electronics are also going to add to at that point.
Wonderful. Yeah. And at the end, which was a bit tricky for me, there's the whole thing with the, as we said, the split octaves. So I've got the E there, which is a C, and then I've got the right hand as well, which is really kind of bizarre. Trying to make those all nudging with each other.
It was certainly useful to know more about the instrument when we started composing for it. So that day that we spent together back in, must have been December 2019, we were learning about the virginals, but also about mean tone tuning and all of these extra bits of detail which allowed us to then go away and think about the compositions. I think really was helpful. So thinking of composers as an audience, as someone that listens as well, I think that these things are intertwined. And so, the challenges for composing, well, there were many because this virginals, and it resides in this museum. So being able to access this instrument and kind of work through this instrument is quite challenging in that sense. For other instruments, you can find other examples. So it's easier to perhaps try out different techniques or sound worlds or whatever it is that you're interested in. But I was helped massively by Peter, who kindly recorded samples of this virginal. So when I put this piece together, I created a sample version of it, so a MIDI version where I could use a small MIDI keyboard to try to emulate some of the different sound worlds of this virginals. So it's possible to overcome some of these challenges, but particularly interesting to learn about the instrument first as a point of view of a listener, as an audience member, before you start thinking compositionally about it.
I think also it's really valuable to be able to have that interaction with the period instruments. I think as composers, it's so important to get hands-on with the sounds that you're working with. And when these instruments are put away and they're kept as pristine as they can, that does sort of remove the composer to be able to get within that authenticity. And I think it's really amazing that Horniman have allowed us to sort of get into the virginals and work with it as Olly has with a sort of sampling instrument. It's sort of connecting the things that we do as composers with period instruments that brings that new authenticity that you're talking about.